in the next session, we are going much on technical side. So the session is titled Going Global with Equity Incentives. And for this session, I would like to invite Mr. Alok Agrawal, partner at Deloitte India, on the stage. Along with him, we'll also have Mark Miller. He's a principal at Deloitte US, who would be joining virtually. So welcome both of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here. I'll hand over to my colleague Mark, who's going to kick off, and I will follow towards the end of the session. Mark, over to you.
Thank you all. Can you hear me okay before I jump in?
Yes.
Audio working? Okay, great. Well, thank you for the team at Capita. Thank you all for joining here today. I've got 30 minutes here, or a little less actually, sharing with Alok here, to try to guide you through the general theme of extending equity incentives or equity awards or ESOPs overseas. And overseas could be from any direction to any other direction. So very, very brief background so I don't burn too much time. My career with Deloitte has lasted about 24 years. Through that entire time, I've focused on equity and incentive compensation. I started in the UK advising on executive compensation strategy and design. And after a few years, I moved to California, which is where I'm coming to you from today, and spent the last 20 or so years sitting in Silicon Valley helping primarily technology companies in all life cycles, from the very early stage startup to the mature, long in the tooth technology companies. I smile because that might mean 15 or 20 years old around here, rather than hundreds in other parts of the world. I apologize for not being with you today. I would have loved to have been there, though I'm actually going to be in India in late January, meeting with some clients and targets of ours and talking at roundtables on exactly this. And my specialty, I lead our equity and incentives practice for Deloitte on a global basis. So I caught the very last part. Can we go to the next slide, please? I caught the very last part of that presentation, but I wish I'd heard all of it. I'm afraid I don't have a cricket analogy for you here, but I am going to start with a similar foundation. I advise a lot of companies on all aspects of what it means to offer equity and incentives globally. And 99 times out of 100, that compensation focuses on compliance or tax planning or something nuanced and technical. And when I always try to do, what I always try to do is to ground companies not just in thinking about what we need to do from a tax, regulatory, or whatever perspective, but never lose sight of that why. Why are we offering equity incentives? And your individual company strategies may well be different, and they should be somewhat unique to each business, but at its heart, they're all similar. They're all around attracting employees or motivating or retaining or aligning employee interests with shareholder interests. Sure, there are other reasons that come into play, like we might have to because our competitors do it, or we might not have the cash, and equity is, quote, a cheap way to pay and motivate the global workforce. All very relevant. The reason I put this slide up here is when I talk to companies that I think do global well, which is to say, if you're an Indian company, you're offering your equity incentive to any country other than India, you're offering to employees in any other country, you should never lose sight of this. Why did you offer it in the first place? And don't get so bogged down in everything else I'm going to talk about that you lose sight of the heart of the incentive program, because ultimately this is intended to be very clearly an incentive, not a compliance obligation, not a disincentive. Don't lose sight of why you started. So that, I want you all to keep this in mind for the next 20 minutes or so as I talk through some of the other themes here. So next slide, please. So the world of global equity as we see it at Deloitte, and this is literally a slide of all of the different services that we help our clients with around global equity. There's a lot. Right? There are many different things that can come into play. Obviously, you need to design the programs. We get into nuanced topics like what happens when people move around the world, or share valuation or business valuation, or different classes of shares, and engagement with corporate life events like IPOs or M&A, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have time to talk about every aspect of this today, but I put this slide up there just to say that I understand there is complexity to this topic, but my goal for today is to ground you in a handful of ideas that you can take away and actually execute with. So if we skip to the next slide, let's take a lot of that noise off the table. What am I going to focus on today? What we're going to focus on here are these four tenets, these four pillars. Really, I'm going to boil it into three, to be honest, because I'm going to combine two. So we need to design the incentives with a global mindset. We need to think about tax and legal, which is really the heart of compliance. And with tax comes local payroll execution. If you have a tax compliance obligation as an employer, the chances are that you need global payroll support to meet whatever that tax obligation might be. And then going back to my earlier point, don't forget why we started. Equity incentives are there to motivate and retain. And when you're offering these on a global basis, that creates a complex employee communication and engagement challenge, but one that you should not shy away from. Otherwise, you run the risk of really missing the whole point of why we're here, why we're getting started. So hopefully that gives us a framework to anchor around for the next few minutes. So first on deck, next slide, please, team. Incentive design. And again, the goal here is to think or help guide some. I'm sure I'm talking to some of you that have operated with global share plans for many, many years, and this is old news. Others of you are perhaps newer to the idea of expanding incentives or ESOPs overseas. So when you're designing a global incentive plan, again, think about why we started. Never lose sight of what are we doing here. You should be designing to motivate and reward behavior. And the design of the incentive is critical, but this is going to inform everything that comes downstream. You cannot design a global incentive plan only with what do we want to motivate and forget about everything else I'm going to talk about. Otherwise, you run the risk of designing a program that works well in theory and philosophy, but execution it can be impossible. I am very well aware that design can be very, very different in different markets, in different cultures, to different populations, to different companies. The companies that offer equity to all employees on a broad basis probably have a very different design than those in maybe more of a executives only or a private equity space. But the principle stands that the design informs everything downstream, and this can often get lost. So for me, a global share plan that is well designed puts the employee first. Employees need to understand it if they're going to be influenced by it. And I mean, what if they're going to be attracted, if they're going to be motivated, if they're going to be retained. If we're going to actually reach our objectives for why we offer, the employee needs to come first. Now, what's interesting here is that the detail of the design can and will inform the tax rules. This to me is the biggest footfall that I see businesses that don't properly plan before they start to expand global plans. They can offer awards that work really well in India, for example, and then they expand that same award to an overseas participant, maybe in the US, could be anywhere in the world. And if the tax does not work, the employee will not be happy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I want to underscore that the detail of the design, what I'm really saying there is the legal documentation, that informs the taxation. And this sometimes gets lost. So a few other points on design, and then I'm going to try to jump into the meat of the content. Another classic and maybe easy idea for you all to take away, for those that are already offering on a global basis, once we move away from the design structure, which when I'm talking there is like, are we talking restricted stocks? Are we talking stock options? Is there a holding period? Do employees have to save to buy the shares, or are they free? That's the core of the design. The next layer of that, which is from a global perspective, is award sizing. This is something that I think it represents a big opportunity for many companies, and many companies get it wrong. I'll go ahead and say many US companies get it wrong. I believe this to be a global challenge. But we're all probably pretty familiar with the idea of pay scales being different for cash compensation in different geographies. Some reason that does not always get bought into with equity comp, but it should. If you're going to pay somebody in, I don't know, country X, one time salary, in country Y, they need to get paid 1.5 times because it's a higher cost of living, a higher cost market for cash. The same principle should apply equally for equity. So when you're expanding overseas, think about award sizing and all of this. Teeing up still, my final tidbit on design is to try to keep it simple. The more I used to spend a lot of time consulting with businesses about how to design really complicated and clever and tax effective equity incentive structures with performance metrics, et cetera, et cetera. Over time, we've seen the appetite for that go lower and lower, and we've seen the emphasis on the companies that really do this well being keep it simple. All back to know your employees, know that they need to understand it to be motivated. The more complicated you get, the more challenging it is for employees. The more complicated you get, the more probable you will find a footfall in some of the other topics, particularly taxation. And so all of that hopefully is clear to the start point at the bottom here. I'm leading up to look before you leap. Whenever you are thinking of expanding an equity award into a new country, make sure that you think about whether the awards that you've already offered, the design that you know and love in India, will work in that other country. It might not. It might work perfectly, but it might not. And it's often too late if you grant and then ask the questions. So what are the sort of things that I'm really talking about here? So taxation first. Next slide, please, team. So there are myriad considerations when you offer equity and incentives in every country, including if you only ever offer in India for that matter. I would argue, and I feel that this is fairly non-controversial, I don't think many would debate me, that the most likely issue to be enforced, to be interrogated by a regulator and to result in penalties, financial penalties, or even worse, whether for the employee or for the company, is tax. It is the most common footfall when we see companies find that their equity awards have cost them money, or when we see an incentive being converted into a disincentive, it's usually tax. And I say this, there are lots of opportunities with taxation. I think most people, some people feel that tax is a moral duty and they should pay it. Most people don't enjoy paying tax and would rather they reduce their tax bill if they can. And look, equity awards offer an opportunity to create a planning. Oftentimes, countries have different tax rates for capital gains. They're often preferable to employment income tax rates. Maybe they have tax qualified or preferred regimes. Lots of countries do. Indeed, India used to. I know you don't for foreign issuers. I don't think you do for Indian issuers anymore either. But lots of countries still have these tax qualified or tax preferred arrangements that you should be aware of before you offer an award in a given country. Maybe you want to structure to try to take advantage of these tax saving opportunities, whether for the company or the employee. Here's the trick though, is the more you look to try to achieve a tax advantage, the more time and design structure you need to change. There is no one equity incentive design that is, quote, tax qualified everywhere in the world. If you want an advantage, you probably need to plan for it. And this is one of the core questions when you start to expand overseas. As a philosophy, do you want to try to structure awards to be tax preferred in as many geographies as possible? Or do you look for more of a global equality, a global just everybody pays tax? Tax is connected to your cost of existence in any country. So maybe it makes sense just to use a common design structure rather than to let tax drive. You know, the tax tail should not wag the design dog, if that's not too trite of an analogy. And so again, I'm going to keep saying the tax is important. It's often the most important when expanding globally. And the part that I underscore for everyone when they're just getting started, and oftentimes for companies, even when they've been doing this for a lot of years, but they've not, maybe they haven't embraced this philosophy, employer first. What do I mean by that? I mean, the employer being the company globally, not just employer in the US or the employer in Germany, globally, you, the business, probably have the very first obligation. This is the North Star that you should take away from this. You as a business probably have a global compliance obligation to understand the tax rules of the ESOP that you're offering, to understand whether you as an employer have to withhold tax, report income in payroll or not, to understand what the complexities are, and potentially to facilitate that withholding and to plan for it, quote, at source, maybe to take shares before you ever give the employee the shares. You need a philosophy and a strategy for that tax collection as an employer. Now, what's challenging here is that that can be informed by the nuance. And what I mean by that is it can be informed by the detail of the plan design. It could also be informed by your cost sharing arrangements, by your transfer pricing. We're even seeing that the accounting can inform the compliance obligations. And I'll give you an example here. We have companies that I support companies that offer equity comp all over the world, probably in over 100 countries. In a lot of geographies, particularly maybe Latin America, Eastern Europe, parts of Asia, whether the company, how the company accounts for the equity comp can actually inform the employer compliance obligation, whether you have to put it in payroll or not. Or maybe it's just the employee reports the income on the year-end tax return and the company does not have any obligation. So it's informed by nuance, and that's just to say, I know this will sound self-serving. This is what I do for a living. I won't hide that. But I encourage all of you to really try to understand and get proper counsel if you're expanding it overseas, to understand what is our obligation, because the way that you as a business operate could result in your compliance obligation in country X being different than the person sat next to you that works at a different company that maybe has a different accounting policy in that same country. So there's a lot of commonality, but it's not all one answer fits all. And the biggest mistake I see a lot of businesses make when they're just getting started in this area is to say, well, gee, we asked the payroll team in Germany how to tax our ESOP, and they know how payroll works, so we're good. We don't need your help, Mark or whoever. And sometimes that's great, but oftentimes it's not, because local payroll teams are often they're generally instruction takers, not advice givers. And even if they understand the basics of taxation of ESOP in their country, they may not know enough about your cost sharing, your recharge, your accounting, even your plan detail to give you good counsel. So I think if any of you are still in that operating environment of relying on local payroll teams, maybe my simple advice would be maybe double check that, because it's often a route to ill-informed counsel. I'm trying to be kind with the words. So just final point on taxation. Next slide, please. So I'm talking about taxation as an execution and compliance obligation. Just this to me, what's the worst that could happen? I'm going to tell a story here. So a couple of years ago, I was on a flight to the UK. I'm English, in case you can't tell by the accent. Live in California. It's a 10, 11-hour flight, depending on which way you're going. I landed on that flight to a client that was panicked like crazy. They had just discovered that their management in the US, it was a international company, not US company. They were offering to the US management stock options. They just discovered that they were not only not tax advantaged, they were actively disadvantaged. For those that are familiar with the US, they'd violated some of our deferred compensation rules, what we call 409 Cap A. That's a tax code section. It meant that the employees were already subject to tax. The shares were not liquid; they couldn't sell them. The tax was also subject. There were penalty taxes as well as regular taxes, and they were literally looking at if the company didn't help these executives out. I mean, some of them were talking about having to mortgage their house or potentially even declare bankruptcy. Now, before I got on that flight, they were all thinking how lucky they were. They were going to have a life-changing wealth event as the IPO was getting closer. And it's a dramatic example, but it's a really real one, team. It resulted very literally in many of those executives quitting because they realized that what they'd been working for the past 3-5 years actually was worthless because tax. And so this is where if you don't pay attention, tax can not only be it can be expensive or compliance failure, penalties, etc., of course, but even without a failure, taxation can turn this incentive into a very active disincentive and destroy all of the value to your stakeholders. And this is not just a US concept, by the way. There are many countries with punitive tax regimes, and nobody wants to pay tax before they can realize cash, or at least I shouldn't say it that way. Most individuals don't want to pay their tax before they can realize a cash sale opportunity. Maybe you do. Maybe you've got a population that can afford to do that and to hedge. That sometimes is a tax planning opportunity, but at least if you do it with your eyes wide open and people want it, you're in the clear. If it's a surprise, it's always unwelcome. And then my last points here, just some US watch points, classic issues that we see when companies offer into the US. If you have discounted stock options, alarm bells are ringing, penalty taxes can apply. When you've got RSUs or RSU type awards where there's a big delay between when the awards vest and when the shares are actually delivered, or when they're no longer subject to a risk of forfeiture, which might not be what you call vest. It's not necessarily the name that's important, it's the legal structure of the plan. Penalty taxes could be triggered. And then awards over anything other than ordinary shares may also be problematic. So just a few watch points there as some practical tips. Would love to spend more time on it, but I'm trying to do everything global at 100 miles an hour here. Okay, let's keep going, team. I'm going to spend maybe 20 seconds on this next slide, maybe not even. I said tax is the most commonly enforced. Next slide, please. The most commonly studied area after tax is probably the regulatory concerns. Offering an ESOP around the world, and this is true in India too, comes with a whole selection of different legal considerations, looking at securities law, looking at trading restrictions, looking at labor law. Do you have exchange control issues? Do you have data privacy considerations? These can and often do inform the design. Indeed, you might conclude using share-based compensation is too hard or too expensive in this country. I'm going to stick to cash. My point here is simple. There are legal regulatory considerations. Be aware of them before you grant. Next slide. And then the last leg of my stool was employee experience, employee communication. So I thought this would interest. Deloitte conducts a survey every year in the US, albeit it's open globally, but I think it's 90% of respondents are US companies, with the National Association of Stock Plan Professionals. This is the latest output from the design survey. If I pulled up the slides for the last 10 years on this survey, that all have a similar theme, just getting more and more pronounced every year. Employee communication and education is a top priority consistently for US companies offering ESOPs in the US and globally, I should say. I will say the same is true when you look at global surveys. I confess I didn't try to dig out any India company survey data specifically asking this question. I probably should have, apologies. I would be surprised if it's not the same. Employee experience is critical. And when you offer on a global basis, employee experience gets much, much harder to do well because you need to think through not just what do I want what I want my people to hear, but what do my people want to hear? What do they need to hear? When do they need to hear it? And how will they understand it? Basics like language start to come into play. And so last slide here on education, please. Turn slide. I thought it might be interesting for you all to just get a point of view from what I spend most of my time in Silicon Valley doing these days. And this is it. It's education. We used to see a world in Silicon Valley and US companies where companies were scared to say too much. Employee communication was almost the domain of the lawyers. Don't say anything wrong, make sure that every comma is in the right place, every T is crossed, every I is dotted. We are seeing a shift. Now, not to say that your communication no longer needs legal input, it still needs to be very robust and accurate, but we're seeing the shift away from it being this reactive minimum that you can see at the bottom of that arrow, the legal obligation, towards companies really saying, how are we going to reach people? We want employees to understand. Companies are getting more and more proactive and thinking of the employee education as a critical component of the complete award, the complete ESOP, so that employees really understand, appreciate, back to that core basics, so that they're motivated, so that they're retained. Why are we doing this in the first place? It's harder when you do it globally, which means you need to double down on that communication initiative. And I'm living this very real, especially in tax, where we're seeing companies go beyond just the basics of, hey, are we going to put your income in payroll or not, to helping employees really understand what they need to do to file tax returns and to potentially in every country they're being offered. So my very, very last slide, and I'll let Alok say a few words. My simple summary team, whenever I speak, I try to make it something you can take home. These are my 3 points. Remember why you started. Why are you offering that equity comp? Never lose sight of that. If you don't already, think about ownership from the center. You as the issuer from the headquarters probably need to have a bit of an understanding of the global laws everywhere you offer equity comp, and ideally before you ever grant. And then that third point here, think about experience and education and go into it with your eyes wide open to cultural differences and cultural expectations. You keep these 3 points in mind, you'll have a very effective global ESOP. That's all.
Thanks, Mark. Completely agree with all your points, equally relevant from an Indian context. So I supplement with some more India-specific implications under tax and regulatory considerations. So as we may have seen, when we have Indian companies issuing ESOPs with underlying shares of the Indian company to employees who are based outside India, you need to factor in the tax implications well in advance, because you have both India tax implications as well as tax implications of the overseas country to consider. So from an India perspective, one important point to note is, since it is shares of the under the Indian tax law, it is treated as income received in India, even though the employee is working and based outside India. So it's a foreign national, let's say it's a resident of the US or the UK, working fully in that country. But if he's getting shares of the Indian company, then under Indian tax rules, under the domestic tax law, it is income received in India. And as a non-resident of India, that individual is still taxable in India on this income. So the only thing which comes to your rescue is the tax treaty which India has with the other country. And it's important to ensure that that individual is a tax resident of that country. Otherwise, you can have some unintended consequences like Mark alluded to. The second point is the second stage. So my previous point about income received in India is at the stage of exercise of options, let's say allotment of shares. Now the second stage, even the second stage has a potential pitfall, which is when the employee sells the shares. And again, you must keep in mind that it is shares of the Indian company. India has a right to tax that capital gains in India under the domestic law. Again, you need to look at the tax treaty. Now here you may have a problem where the tax treaty does not offer any protection for capital gains. So let's say if you look at the India-US and the India-UK treaties, neither of them offer any protection to capital gains. Both countries have a right to tax the capital gains as per their domestic law. So you could have a problem where India refuses to let go of the capital gains tax for this US or UK resident, even though that individual has never set foot in India. But what could come to the rescue is foreign tax credit provisions under the domestic tax laws. So fortunately, in both these cases, the US and the UK would typically allow a foreign tax credit of the India taxes, but that may not necessarily be the case in other countries. So it's important not only to look at the tax treaties and the tax residency status of the individual, but also the domestic tax provisions of the overseas country, because that may be a problem area, let's say, for capital gains. Now, another typical situation is for countries with unique tax provisions, even at the stage of exercise of options, let's say like Singapore. We all know that Singapore has a deemed exercise concept. So especially when you're granting to your employees in countries such as Singapore, you need to ensure that you've thought through the employees, let's say if you're going to be transferring the employee at some point to the Indian operations or to some other country, where you may have a tax impact in Singapore even before the employee gets access to the shares. So that needs to be considered. We spoke about other considerations, regulatory considerations. So we have a lot of restructuring of companies before they launch an IPO, before they list. So you need to keep in mind, let's say either if you're flipping the structure from India to overseas, we have many companies who are flipping back to India, reverse flipping, or you may have divestments of businesses out of the Indian company into a second Indian company. So again, to take Mark's point, what is important is to keep the goal in mind. Your goal is to reward certain employees. If you are very focused on the corporate considerations of this restructuring without keeping in mind how that's going to impact the individual who you sought to benefit from the share plan, then you may have a problem. So for example, under the company law regulations in unlisted company scenario, you cannot grant ESOPs to sister companies, right? You may be able to do that in a public listed company scenario under the SEBI regulations, but you need to keep some of these aspects in mind with respect to the specific employees while you are undergoing a restructuring of the group. Final operational point is, recently some clarifications from the Reserve Bank with respect to the foreign direct investment regulations. Yes, when you are granting ESOPs or share instruments of the Indian company to employees based overseas, it is treated as foreign direct investment. Now, many companies were under the impression that if it's a cashless exercise where there is no money being paid, it's a net, let's say sell to cover, or if there's a trust involved and the trust is transferring the shares to the non-resident employee, then you don't need to comply with the FDI filings with the Reserve Bank, but the RBI has clarified that you need to comply in all these cases. So, keep in mind that the FEMA regulations are also important to comply with respect to share grants or ESOP participants in your overseas operations. So that was a quick 200-mile mark, if I can borrow your summary of the regulatory considerations to keep in mind. That's all from us. Thank you. And thanks once again to Lakshman, Ravi, and the Capita team for having us here.
Alok, it was really nice to get insights from you. A lot of taxation we spoke about. Alok, I would want you to come back on stage. And Rahul, if you can just come on the stage to felicitate Alok.